Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Firefighter adopts 5 abandoned babies. 20 years later he's shocked when Robert Green, a man in his 40s, lived in a small wooden house in the town of Willow Creek, a peaceful and quaint place nestled deep in a valley. As the only firefighter in the town's fire department, Robert was always dedicated to his work and wholeheartedly served others. He was beloved by everyone in town for his kindness and tireless sacrifice, but behind his calm exterior was a loneliness that had lasted for many years. Robert had no family, no wife, no children, only his work and long shifts. His life would have continued peacefully like that until one fateful day when a massive fire broke out in an apartment building at the edge of town. That night, the dark sky was torn apart by fierce red flames, filled with screams and panic. Robert and his teammates were called to the scene, sirens blaring throughout the town. Smoke billowed from the burning building, the smell of charred wood and cries for help piercing the air. Robert shouted to his teammates, "We have to save everyone now. Hurry up." When the fire truck stopped, Robert jumped out in his protective gear, but chaos had taken over. People were running in all directions, trying to escape the quickly spreading flames, while small children cried in the arms of adults. The air was hot and suffocating, with sparks flying everywhere. In that chaotic moment, Robert heard a terrified scream from a small child on the upper floor of the building. He rushed up the stairs, where flames were already licking at the old wooden steps. His heart pounded, sweat streaming down his face, but he did not hesitate. When he reached the second floor, he saw 5 girls, aged between 4 and 10, huddled together in the corner of a room. Their eyes were wet with tears, and their faces were full of fear. The oldest girl cried out, "Please help us." Robert quickly ran over, picked up the 2 youngest children, and led the other 3 down the stairs, which were already engulfed in flames. The thick smoke made the girls cough and choke. Robert shouted, "Stay calm. I'll get you out safely. Hurry, we need to get out right now." As they reached the bottom floor, a loud explosion erupted from above, and the whole building shook. Wood and debris from the ceiling fell, blocking their way out. Robert felt his chest tighten as he realized they were trapped. He frantically searched for a way out, his eyes darting everywhere. "No, this can't be happening," he whispered, a feeling of helplessness engulfing his mind. Suddenly, Robert spotted a window at the end of the hallway. Although it was covered in smoke, it was their only chance. He shouted, "Girls, quick! Run to the window!" He ran over and used all his strength to break the glass, pulling each girl through. While lifting the smallest girl through the window, his hand was cut by broken glass, but he felt no pain, only an overwhelming fear that he might not make it in time. Once he had gotten the last girl out, Robert turned to look at the building. Flames had devoured most of the interior structure, and he knew the girls' parents hadn't made it out. The girls huddled together, crying uncontrollably at the horrifying sight. Robert stood there, his hands trembling, unable to believe what had just happened. One of his teammates, Charles, approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder and said, "We did everything we could. You saved the girls, but their parents didn't make it." Robert looked up, his eyes filled with tears. He turned to see the 5 shivering girls, none of them saying a word. His heart felt like it was being squeezed. These children had lost everything in one terrifying night. Charles quietly added, "We need to take them to the orphanage, they'll be taken care of there." But Robert didn't respond. Inside him, something was growing, a deep sense of responsibility and compassion. These children had lost their families, could he leave them to face separation again? The next morning, the town of Willow Creek was still shrouded in the sadness of the tragic fire. The sky was gray, with smoke lingering, and the smell of ashes still strong. Families from the town gathered around the burnt-out building, their faces filled with loss and sorrow. Ambulances had come early in the morning, not to carry the living, but to transport those who no longer breathed. Robert sat on the steps of the fire station, his eyes red from a sleepless night. He couldn't forget the look in the eyes of those 5 girls, their desperate fear as they clung to each other, and the sight of their parents' bodies being pulled from the rubble. He stared down at his hands. His hands, which had saved so many lives, now couldn't save the families of those children. He couldn't stop the thoughts that swirled deeply in his mind. If I had arrived sooner, if I had been just a bit faster, would they still be alive? Charles, his colleague, came over and sat next to him. Charles was an experienced firefighter who had faced many tragedies, but he couldn't hide his fatigue. Charles looked at Robert and sighed softly. "Robert, you did everything you could. Sometimes, these things can't be prevented." Robert shook his head, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't save them, Charles. Those girls, they've lost everything." Charles hesitated. "I know. But, no one could have done better than you in that situation. Now they'll be taken to the orphanage in the big city." Robert closed his eyes tightly, imagining those 5 small, frightened girls being taken to a strange place where no one familiar would be with them. The orphanage, a place where people always said children would be cared for, but he knew how harsh and cold life could be there. Those children, they had lost everything, and now they would have to face a lonely life, separated, with no one to protect them. Robert stood up abruptly, his heart pounding, feeling something urging him to act immediately. He spoke loudly, almost shouting. "No. I won't let them be taken away. I'll take care of them." Charles looked at Robert, surprised. "What are you saying? Robert, how can you take care of 5 children at once? You're a firefighter, your work is dangerous, and you don't even have a family." Robert looked Charles straight in the eyes, determination clear in his voice. "I can't abandon them, Charles. I can't let them be separated and thrown into a place without love. They need a family. I'll be that family." Charles looked at Robert, then sighed and shook his head. "You're always so stubborn, Robert. But this is real life, not a movie. You have no idea how hard this will be." Robert gave a sad smile, looking off into the distance. "I know, Charles. But those children have lost everything. I can't stand by and watch them be hurt anymore. If I don't do something, I'll never forgive myself." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a large truck from the orphanage. Ms. Mary, the head of the orphanage, got out with a stern expression. She was an older woman, her hair turning gray, and her face lined with life's experiences. Mary looked at Robert and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Robert, we're here to take the children. I know this is a difficult time, but we have to follow the rules. The children need professional care." Robert stood in front of her, his eyes resolute. "No. I will take care of them." Mary raised an eyebrow, a look of surprise crossing her face. "You? Robert, you're a firefighter with no children. You think you can take care of 5 orphan children? You don't even have the time." Robert gritted his teeth. "I know. But I'll learn. I'll do everything I can to make sure they're not separated. They've already lost too much, they can't lose each other too." Mary sighed, her expression softening a bit. "Robert, this isn't something to take lightly. They need a safe place and professional care. You can't do this alone." Robert shook his head, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I won't let the girls be split up. I'll do whatever it takes to become the father they need." Mary looked at Robert in silence for a moment, then turned to Charles with a questioning look. Charles shrugged, then spoke softly. "If anyone can pull this off, it's Robert." Finally, Mary sighed again, her face full of worry but with a hint of admiration. She shook her head slightly and said, "All right, if you're really that determined, but remember, this is an enormous responsibility, Robert. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. I'll be checking in regularly." And if there are any issues, I'll have to bring the girls back to the orphanage. Robert nodded, feeling both relieved and overwhelmed by the weight of his decision. He turned back to the 5 girls, huddled close together, their faces still filled with fear. He walked over, knelt to meet them at eye level, and gently said, "I'll be taking care of you from now on. I promise I won't let anything scare you again." The oldest girl, her eyes watery but bravely trying to hold it together, stepped forward. You really won't let us be separated, will you?" Robert smiled, his voice full of certainty. "I promise." As the decision was made, Robert immediately felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. These children needed more than just a house, they needed love and care, things he wasn't sure he could provide. But he knew, if he didn't try, who would? Who else would dare to take on this burden? That afternoon, Robert brought the 5 girls back to his home. As the wooden door creaked open, he could sense the awkwardness on both sides. His house had never hosted children before, it was just a shelter for a single man, with a few worn-out pieces of furniture and hardly any warmth. Mary, the orphanage supervisor, stood outside, giving him one last look of concern. She doubted that a man like Robert could truly manage such a monumental responsibility. She asked one last time before leaving. "Robert, are you absolutely certain about this? Once you start, there's no turning back." He looked her straight in the eyes without hesitation. "I'm certain." Mary sighed, shaking her head lightly but saying nothing more. She climbed into her car, leaving Robert with the 5 girls standing on his porch. Robert bent down, his gaze soft as he looked into the worried faces of the young girls. He smiled gently, trying to break the tension. "All right, let's go inside. This will be your new home from now on." The children stepped cautiously into the house, their eyes darting around to take in every small corner of the old wooden cabin. The youngest girl, Isabella, clung tightly to her older sister's shirt, her eyes red and still filled with fear. She looked up at Robert, her lips trembling. You won't leave us, will you?" Robert's heart ached. He stepped closer, bent down, and gently patted Isabella's head. "No, I'll never leave you. We'll be together, all of us." The first night in their new home passed in silence. The air was heavy as Robert tried to prepare dinner for the 5 children. He fumbled in the kitchen, trying to figure out something simple, but everything seemed to be working against him. Pots and pans clanged loudly, smoke rose from the frying pan, and the smell of burnt food filled the room. "Damn it!" Robert muttered as he tried to put out a small flame that had begun to flare up from the pan. The girls sat silently at the table, watching him with nervous eyes. One of the girls, the oldest one, Sophia, walked over to Robert, her voice quiet but filled with courage. "Can I help, sir?" Robert turned, sweat beading on his forehead, attempting a weak smile. "You know how to cook?" Sophia nodded, her eyes reflecting a maturity beyond her years. "My mom taught me before everything happened." Sophia's words cut deeply into Robert's heart. He could see in her eyes a pain so profound that no words could fully express it. In that moment, Sophia was no longer just a child. She had become the support for her younger siblings, even though she was still too young to fully grasp life's hardships. Robert stepped aside, and Sophia quickly took charge. Her movements were still a bit clumsy, but her determination and patience were clear. While Sophia cooked, the other 4 girls sat silently, watching their sister intently. A little later, the comforting aroma of soup began to fill the room. Robert felt a bit more at ease but couldn't hide his own discomfort. He never imagined that fatherhood would be this challenging. For a moment, he remembered his previous single life, where everything was simple and there were no responsibilities besides his job. But now, with just 5 children, his entire world had changed. When the simple meal was finally set on the table, the girls sat down, still a bit cautious but no longer as tense as before. Robert looked around the table, sensing the awkward silence. He knew it would take time to create a true family atmosphere. Just as things started to settle, the front door suddenly opened. Victor, Robert's nearest neighbor, walked in. He was an elderly man, retired, and known for his gruff and unfriendly personality. Victor looked around, squinting as he took in the sight of 5 children sitting in Robert's home. In a hoarse voice, he said, "Do you really think you can take care of these 5 kids, Robert? You're a firefighter, not a father. This is ridiculous." Robert looked at Victor, his gaze steady, without any hint of anger. He simply replied calmly, "I know I'm not a perfect father. But I'll try my best. They deserve to be loved and to stay together." Victor shook his head, scoffing. "You're a dreamer, Robert. You won't last." Robert stayed silent, not arguing. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd hear such remarks. But deep down, he understood that as long as he had the determination, he could succeed. The first days of Robert's new life with the 5 girls were a series of challenges. Robert, a firefighter used to facing danger and emergency situations, now had to face a completely different type of challenge, caring for and raising children. His previously simple life had turned into a whirlwind, from organizing schedules for each child to handling small daily conflicts. On the first morning, Robert was jolted awake by Isabella's shrill cries, the youngest of the 5 sisters. He jumped up, barely realizing what was happening. In Robert's mind, he was still used to reacting swiftly to emergency calls, but now, the urgency wasn't coming from a fire, it was from the children right in his own home. He rushed out of his room to find Isabella huddled in a corner of the living room, clutching her stuffed bear. Sophia, her older sister, was trying to comfort her but didn't know what to do. Sophia's face was etched with worry. "What's wrong? What's happening?" Robert asked frantically, feeling utterly helpless. Sophia turned around, her eyes wet with tears. "Isabella, she's afraid of the dark. Every night. Mom used to sit by her bed until she fell asleep." Robert sighed, his heart heavy. How could he ever replace the role of a mother? He gently approached, sat beside Isabella, and rubbed her back comfortingly. "It's all right. I'm here now. There's nothing to be afraid of." But Isabella didn't stop crying, her round eyes staring at Robert with a look of confusion and loneliness. Robert realized that his words of comfort weren't enough. The girls had experienced such a huge loss, and their fear and pain couldn't just disappear with a few promises. A week later, the difficulties only piled up. Something as simple as cooking for 5 children turned out to be a much bigger challenge than Robert had imagined. That morning, he decided to make simple fried eggs for breakfast, but everything went wrong. The pan burned black, the eggs broke apart, and the kids looked at him with both curiosity and hesitation. Ellen, the second oldest, shook her head slightly. "Don't you know how to cook? My mom made eggs way better than this." Robert forced a smile, but inside, he felt the pressure growing bit by bit. Every day, he realized more and more that he could never replace the mother these girls had lost. He had never thought he would be cooking, caring for, or even doing laundry for 5 children at once. It was exhausting him, both physically and mentally. Other problems kept arising, too. Each child had a unique personality, and they didn't always get along. One day, while Robert was trying to clean up the dishes after lunch, a loud argument erupted from the living room. When he rushed over, he saw Caroline, the third oldest, arguing with Ellen. Caroline's face was red as she clutched a doll tightly, yelling, "This is mine. You can't take it." Ellen, equally defiant, snapped back. "You haven't played with it all week. Why can't I play with it now?" Robert stepped in, trying to intervene, but neither child was willing to listen. He felt helpless, unsure how to resolve these little conflicts between the girls. That evening, after all 5 children had gone to bed, Robert sat down in a chair, buried his head in his hands, and sighed deeply. He had never felt so drained. His previous life as a bachelor had been peaceful and simple, but now everything seemed completely turned upside down. Not a day went by without problems. While he was lost in thought, the front door suddenly opened. Mr. Victor, the elderly neighbor who had always doubted Robert's decision, walked in. He looked around, his cold gaze scanning the toys scattered on the floor and the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. He chuckled lightly. "I told you, Robert. You can't do this. It's too much for you. Just take them back to the orphanage. Stop trying." Robert looked up at Mr. Victor, his eyes weary but still full of determination. "I made a promise to them, Mr. Victor. I won't abandon them." Mr. Victor sighed, sitting in the chair across from Robert. "But you need to understand, raising children isn't just about love. You need more than that: patience, time, and experience. You don't have those things." Robert was silent for a moment before he spoke slowly. "You're right. I don't have experience, and sometimes I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. But I can't give up. Those kids, they've lost everything. I can't let them lose again." Mr. Victor looked at Robert, his aged eyes softening a bit. He nodded and then unexpectedly said, "You need help, Robert. You can't do everything alone." Robert was surprised but couldn't deny it. He was completely worn out, and everything seemed to be beyond his abilities. Mr. Victor stood up, heading toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back and said, "I'm no good at cooking, but if you need someone to help fix up this house to make it more suitable for the kids, just call me." Robert smiled, feeling a bit of warmth in his heart. Though Mr. Victor's words were harsh, he had offered genuine help. Robert knew that no matter how tough things got, he had someone's support. Even with Mr. Victor's assistance, raising 5 children didn't get any easier. In fact, every day felt like Robert was swimming in a vast sea of challenges. Everything seemed beyond his capacity, from managing schedules to understanding the girls' emotional needs. One morning, as Robert was trying to finish breakfast preparations, Caroline, the third oldest, suddenly ran into the kitchen, her face scrunched up with frustration. "Mr. Robert. Ellen hid my notebook. How am I supposed to do my homework now?" Before Robert could answer, Ellen stepped into the kitchen from the living room, her voice rising defensively. "I didn't hide it. You probably left it somewhere. Don't blame me." The two girls started bickering loudly, making Robert feel like his head was about to explode. He tried to intervene. "Enough. Both of you, sit down and have breakfast. We'll look for Caroline's notebook afterward." Ellen pouted. "I'm not hungry." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "But I need to do my homework, or the teacher will punish me." Lucy, the fourth child, was often the one who knew how to calm the tense situations between her sisters. She had a gentle soul and was usually the one to step in and resolve conflicts within the family. Lucy was good at listening and understanding others' feelings, though sometimes even she felt helpless. Robert sighed. This wasn't the first time the girls had argued over little things, but every time, he felt the pressure mounting. How could he solve every problem when he lacked the skills and experience of a parent? Each child carried their own wounds, their own unhealed pain, and he couldn't ease them all at once. The challenges weren't limited to home life. Getting the girls to settle in at their new school also brought its own set of difficulties. On their first day, Robert had to personally take each girl to school. As soon as they entered the classroom, the other students' eyes focused on the girls. Some whispered, others teased. Ellen, the second oldest, was subjected to murmurs. "That girl's an orphan. All 5 sisters are." A large boy stood in front of Ellen, sneering. "No parents, huh? Bet no one loves you." Ellen's face flushed, her eyes stinging, but she held back her tears. She took a deep breath, turned away, but the hurt in her heart was obvious. That night, when they got home, Ellen hid in her room, refusing to eat or talk to anyone. Robert stood worried outside Ellen's door, knocking softly. "Ellen, come out and eat dinner, sweetheart." Inside, there was only silence. Robert kept knocking, his voice becoming more earnest. "I know you're upset, but you can't lock yourself away like this. I'm here if you need to talk." The only response was a soft sobbing. Robert sighed, feeling helpless. These children needed more than just a father figure, they needed a place to express and release their pain. But he couldn't replace the love of the parents they had lost. Another night, while Robert was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, Sophia, the oldest sister, approached him. She had always taken on the role of the big sister, looking after her siblings whenever Robert wasn't around. But tonight, Sophia no longer held her usual strength, her face showing clear signs of exhaustion. "Mr. Robert," Sophia whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't know if I can keep going. I'm so tired." Robert turned to look into Sophia's sad eyes. She had been carrying too many responsibilities for a child her age. He stepped forward, placed a hand on her shoulder, and spoke gently. "I'm sorry, Sophia. You've been doing so much for me. But you're still a child. You don't have to carry all this on your own. You deserve to rest, to cry if you need to." Sophia bit her lip, tears threatening to spill. She had grown accustomed to appearing strong in front of her younger sisters, but in the end, she was just a child. Robert pulled her close, embracing her in his arms. For the first time, Sophia broke down and sobbed in front of Robert, and he felt her pain deeply, not just the physical loss, but the emotional wounds that had never truly healed. Robert sat beside Sophia, feeling a heavier weight of responsibility than ever. But he couldn't give up. He knew he had to keep going because there was no one else to care for and love these children. The next morning, Mr. Victor paid another visit. He brought along an old wooden toolbox filled with tools Robert had never seen before. Setting the box on the table, he spoke in his rough voice. "You said you needed help fixing up the house, right? I may not be a great father, but I know how to repair things around the house." Robert smiled, feeling a bit of hope stirring inside. Perhaps Mr. Victor wasn't as difficult as he'd thought. "Thank you, Victor. This house needs a lot of work." The two men got to work. Mr. Victor was a quiet, reserved man but incredibly patient and meticulous. While repairing a broken window, he unexpectedly spoke up. "You know, Robert. I once had a son." Robert paused, surprised. Mr. Victor had never mentioned his family. He asked gently. "You had a son?" Mr. Victor nodded, his gaze distant. "He died in an accident. Afterward, my wife couldn't bear the loss, and she passed away as well. Since then, I've had no one." Robert felt a heaviness in his heart. He'd never imagined that Mr. Victor had such a sorrowful past. Mr. Victor continued, his voice even more strained. "You know, Robert, losing a child is the greatest pain anyone can endure. But you're fighting so these children won't have to go through that. I respect that." Robert didn't know what to say other than a heartfelt thank you. Mr. Victor might not have been easy to get along with, but Robert now understood he, too, had suffered great loss. And now, they found a bit of solace in helping these children together. Though the hardships continued, Robert started to realize that he wasn't alone on this journey. People like Sophia, Mr. Victor, and even Charles, his colleague, had been silently supporting him through these challenging times. He didn't know if he could become the perfect father to these children, but he knew he would never give up. Love and patience were all he had, and he was willing to give everything to protect the children he had promised to care for. As time passed, the young girls Robert had once taken in grew into strong and independent young women. Sophia, the eldest, went on to study psychology in college, driven by a desire to help others who had experienced loss, just like her and her sisters. Ellen, always rebellious and full of energy, had become an intelligent and creative young woman pursuing her passion in art. Caroline, the quietest of the girls, excelled academically and dreamed of becoming a doctor. Lucy, with her creative and gentle nature, found her calling in interior design, passionate about transforming spaces into warm, emotionally uplifting places. Isabella, the youngest, grew out of her shyness and decided to become an advocate for animal welfare. Their lives were far from easy, but the bond they shared with Robert had helped them weather every storm. The small house that once felt so empty now overflowed with life and laughter, each family member playing their unique role. However, Robert began to notice that his health wasn't what it used to be. Fatigue lingered, and he often felt a tightness in his chest whenever he overexerted himself. Though he tried to hide these issues from the girls, Sophia, with her perceptive nature, started noticing something was wrong. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Sophia suddenly asked, "Dad, Robert, you haven't seemed well lately. Are you sure everything is all right?" Robert paused, his eyes reflecting a hint of worry, but he quickly smiled, trying to reassure them. "It's nothing, just a bit of fatigue from work. Don't worry about me." But Sophia wasn't easily convinced. Her gaze stayed fixed on Robert, unable to mask her concern. The next day, when Sophia took Robert to the doctor, they received devastating news: Robert had a serious heart condition and needed surgery immediately. His heart was weakening, and without treatment, his life was at significant risk. Robert sat in stunned silence as he absorbed the news. His fear wasn't for himself but for his daughters. He had promised to care for them for as long as he lived, to be their protector and source of love, but now he was the one who needed protection. He couldn't bear the thought of them enduring another loss. The doctor said, "Mr. Robert, surgery is essential, but you'll also need rest and a lifestyle change afterward. This will be a long and challenging journey." On the way home, Robert's heart felt heavy. He didn't know how to break the news to his daughters without frightening them. But he knew that no matter how much he wanted to keep it from them, the girls would inevitably find out. When they got home, Sophia was already waiting by the door, her face lined with worry. Ellen, Caroline, and Lucy sat around the table, their eyes not leaving their father's face. Isabella leaned against the wall, biting her lip, her face full of anxiety. Robert knew the time had come, he couldn't hide it any longer. "I need to tell you all something," Robert began, his voice soft but heavy with the weight of his news. "The doctor said I have a heart condition, and I need surgery immediately." The room fell silent. The girls' faces showed shock and fear as they looked at Robert. Sophia was the first to break the silence. "What? A heart condition? Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Her voice trembled, unable to hide her fear. Robert took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I didn't want to worry you. I thought I could handle it on my own, but now I can't hide it anymore. The surgery carries risks, but if it's successful, I'll need a long period of rest." Ellen jumped up, her voice filled with anger and worry. "You've been working too hard for us. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Caroline and Lucy's eyes welled up with tears. Isabella burst into tears, running over to hug Robert tightly. "I don't want to lose you, Dad, Robert. You're the only family we have." Robert felt his throat tighten. He knew he had caused them worry and fear, but this was something he couldn't avoid. He hugged Isabella close, his eyes wet, trying to reassure her. "It'll be okay. I'll do my best to come back to you all." After learning about Robert's illness, the entire family was consumed with worry and fear. Sophia, Ellen, Caroline, Lucy, and Isabella couldn't hide their unease. The reality that Robert, their father who had loved, cared for, and been their rock all these years, was now the one in need of care weighed heavily on them. But instead of giving in to worry, they decided to come together and do everything they could to help him through this difficult time. On the morning of Robert's surgery, the girls had prepared themselves from early on. Sophia, the eldest, took the lead, assigning tasks to each of them. She knew she had to be strong, not letting fear take over her mind. Caroline, you'll help pack Dad's things. Ellen, you take care of things around the house so everything's ready when Dad comes home. Isabella and Lucy, you'll stay by Dad's side as much as possible. We have to keep a positive spirit for him, Sophia said, her voice filled with determination, though her heart was still gripped with worry. As the family entered Robert's hospital room, he lay on the hospital bed connected to an IV drip and a beeping heart monitor. The girls stood quietly for a moment, holding back the pain in their hearts. Robert saw them come in and tried to smile, though his face looked pale and tired. "Why do you all look so sad?" "I'm just resting a little," Robert said, trying to sound optimistic, but his voice was weaker than usual. Isabella, the youngest, walked over to his bedside and held his hand tightly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept her voice steady as best she could. "Promise us you'll get better, Dad. We need you." Looking into Isabella's innocent eyes, Robert felt his heart break. He nodded, giving a faint smile. "I promise. I'll do my best." The doctor entered the room, gently informing them it was time to take Robert into surgery. The girls stepped back, allowing the nurses to move him, but Sophia couldn't hold back her tears. Seeing her father lying on the stretcher, she ran over and grasped his hand one last time. "Please come back to us, Dad." "Robert. We've already lost our parents once, we can't bear to go through that again," Sophia said, her voice breaking. Robert squeezed Sophia's hand, his gaze full of love. "I'll come back, Sophia. You girls mean everything to me. I won't leave you alone." The girls stood in the hospital hallway, watching as the doors to the operating room closed. A heavy silence filled the space, with only the sound of their racing hearts echoing within them. They sat quietly in the waiting area, their eyes fixed on the closed doors, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. After hours of waiting, the doctor finally emerged. His face was weary but carried a faint look of relief. The surgery was a success. However, Robert will need a long recovery period. We'll keep him here for further monitoring. Hearing that the surgery was successful, the girls breathed sighs of relief, tears of happiness streaming down their faces. But they knew their journey wasn't over. They would have to face a long road ahead, helping their father fully recover. In the weeks that followed, Robert remained in the hospital for observation and treatment. His daughters took turns watching over him by his bedside. Sophia took charge of managing his medications and discussing his condition with the doctors. Ellen tried her best to keep the atmosphere light, telling funny stories she would come up with to make both her father and her sisters laugh. Caroline, with her budding medical knowledge, assisted the doctors in caring for Robert, while Isabella spent every moment beside him, making sure he never felt alone. One day, Robert awoke from a long nap to find his daughters sitting by his side. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over their beloved faces. His heart filled with happiness, despite his still weak body. "Sophia, Ellen, Caroline, Lucy, Isabella, you've all grown up," Robert said, his voice raspy but full of affection. "I don't know how to thank you. Without you, I couldn't have made it through this." Sophia leaned down, holding Robert's hand as tears welled up in her eyes. "We're the ones who should be thanking you, Dad. You spent your life caring for us and loving us. Now it's our turn to take care of you." Robert looked at his daughters, feeling the love and connection in his family stronger than ever. Though life had thrown countless challenges their way, it was their love that had carried him through. He knew that, although the road ahead would be long, they would face it together, and nothing could separate them. Months after Robert's surgery, the small house in the town of Willow Creek gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Robert had recovered to some extent, though he strictly adhered to the doctor's orders to rest and avoid heavy work. But in his heart, there was a peace he had never felt before. This peace came not only from his improving health but also from the love and sacrifice he had felt from his daughters. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the windows, Robert sat on the sofa, looking out at the garden. Sophia was trimming the flower bed she had tended to while Robert was in the hospital. Ellen sat on the porch steps, sketching in her notebook, while Isabella played with Caroline and Lucy alongside a small dog Caroline had adopted from the animal shelter. All these simple things warmed Robert's heart. "Dad!" Isabella called out from the garden, running toward him with her small steps, her face lit up with a bright smile. "You're feeling much better, aren't you? Can we go for a walk together?" Robert smiled and nodded slightly. He stood up, moving slowly, but Isabella quickly took his hand, as if to make sure he wouldn't lose his balance. It was a small gesture, but it choked Robert with emotion. This little girl had grown up so much from the once shy child who had been afraid of her own shadow. As the family walked together through the nearby park, Sophia slowed her pace to walk beside Robert, her eyes shining with a maturity he had always admired. She spoke softly. "Dad, I've thought a lot about everything we've been through. You've changed our lives, and I'm grateful for that every day." Robert shook his head, his voice warm and sincere. "No, Sophia. It was you girls who changed my life. Before I had you, I was just a lonely man, working without knowing what I was living for. But you all gave me purpose, gave me a real family." Ellen came up from behind, hearing their conversation, and added without hesitation. "I remember how stubborn I used to be, always arguing with you. But you never gave up on me. You've been the best father I could ever wish for, blood or not." Robert felt his eyes grow wet. He couldn't find words to express the emotions flooding his heart. His love for his daughters was more than just a sense of responsibility as a father, it was a deep bond forged through the years they had shared together. A little while later, as they returned home, Mr. Victor, their neighbor, was waiting at the door. He had become a close friend of the family, always there to help Robert during tough times. Today, he carried a basket of fruits from his garden, smiling softly as he saw Robert return with his daughters. "Looks like you're on the mend, Robert," Mr. Victor said, his gruff voice carrying a hint of warmth. Robert shook his hand, smiling. "Thanks to my daughters, I was able to recover so quickly." Mr. Victor nodded, his gaze turning to the girls with admiration. He spoke in a serious tone. "I've lived my whole life thinking family had to be bound by blood. I thought only blood relatives could love and protect each other, but you and these girls have proven otherwise." Sophia stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Family is where there's love, sacrifice, and care. That's everything Dad Robert has taught us. We couldn't have asked for a better father." Ellen, always outspoken, added. "Dad Robert didn't just save us from that fire years ago, he saved us from loneliness, loss, separation, and despair. To us, he is our family." Mr. Victor nodded quietly, feeling the warmth radiate from Robert and his daughters. He remembered those early days when Robert decided to take in all 5 girls. Back then, he had thought it was a foolish and reckless decision. But now, he knew he had been wrong. Robert had not only created a family but had also built a home filled with love and connection. The entire family sat down for dinner with Mr. Victor, the soft yellow light illuminating their happy faces. Robert looked around the table, his heart brimming with joy and contentment. The girls he had once taken in had grown into strong, independent women. But most importantly, they were still a family, despite not sharing the same blood. After dinner, when everyone had retired to their rooms, Robert stood alone on the porch, gazing up at the starlit sky. He thought back to that first day, standing in front of the burned-down building and seeing the girls for the first time. That seemingly impulsive decision had become the moment that changed his entire life. Sophia came out and stood beside Robert, gently holding his hand. She spoke softly. "I've always believed that family isn't just about who we're born to, it's about who loves us and is willing to sacrifice for us. You taught me that. Robert squeezed Sophia's hand, his voice thick with emotion. I can't imagine what my life would have been without you girls. You're everything to me. Sophia smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And you're everything to us, too. Robert realized the most precious thing he had in life, this family. A family built not on blood, but on love, sacrifice, and patience. This made him certain that, no matter how many challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because they were a family, forever.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.